When a wealthy CEO makes a business deal with a homeless woman, he never expects it to turn his perfectly ordered life upside down. As their lives become increasingly entangled, they both must face difficult choices about love, family, and what truly matters in life. Can two people from completely different worlds find happiness together, or will society's expectations tear them apart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. Daniel Everett stood at the window of his penthouse office, looking down at the city below. At 45 years old, he had everything money could buy, except what he wanted most, an heir to his fortune. The doctors had been clear, he couldn't have children naturally. Now time was running out. "Mr. Everett, the board is waiting," his assistant Sarah reminded him. Daniel straightened his designer tie and headed to the conference room. The faces around the table were familiar: old money, white hair, and expectations. His family had built this empire over generations, and they all wanted to know who would carry on the legacy. "Daniel, we need to discuss succession," Richard Montgomery, the eldest board member, said bluntly. "Your father had an heir by your age." The words stung, but Daniel kept his face neutral. He'd heard it all before, from his mother at Sunday dinners, from his sister Caroline at charity events, from everyone who mattered in their exclusive social circle. He needed an heir, and he needed one soon. Later that night, driving through the poorer side of town after a failed business meeting, Daniel's Ferrari crawled past the homeless people lining the streets. He barely noticed them anymore. They were as much a part of the landscape as the graffiti on the walls. But then he saw her. She was different from the others. Even in worn clothes, there was pride in how she carried herself. She sat on a bench, sketching in a tattered notebook, seemingly lost in her own world. Her dark skin contrasted with a bright yellow scarf tied around her hair. Daniel pulled over, an idea forming in his mind. If he needed a surrogate, why not someone with nothing to lose? Someone who would be grateful for the money and disappear afterward. It was perfect. No connections to his social circle, no complications. He got out of his car, ignoring the surprised looks from passers-by. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the woman. She looked up, and Daniel was struck by the intelligence in her eyes. She didn't cower or beg like he expected. Instead, she closed her notebook and met his gaze directly. "Can I help you?" Her voice was clear, educated, another surprise. "I have a business proposition," Daniel said, keeping his voice low. "One that could change your life." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not that kind of woman." "No, nothing like that," Daniel said quickly. "My name is Daniel Everett. I'd like to discuss something legitimate. Over coffee, in public." She studied him for a long moment. "I'm Layla," she finally said, "and you're right about one thing. I do need coffee." At the diner across the street, Daniel laid out his proposal. He needed a surrogate mother for his child. He would provide everything during the pregnancy: a place to live, medical care, good food. Afterward, she would get enough money to start a new life somewhere else. Layla listened without interrupting, stirring her coffee slowly. When he finished, she smiled, but it wasn't the grateful smile he expected. "Let me make sure I understand," she said. "You want me to carry your child because I'm homeless and desperate, because you think I'll take the money and disappear, because no one in your world would ever believe I was anything more than a paid incubator." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Hearing it laid out so bluntly made him sound terrible. "But here's what you don't know about me," Layla continued. "I have a master's degree in art. I worked as a gallery curator until I got sick and lost everything to medical bills. I'm not just some charity case you can use and discard." She stood up to leave, but Daniel caught her arm. "Wait," he said. "Name your terms." Layla sat back down. "If we do this, I want respect. I want to be treated like a human being, not a transaction. I want my own space, my own life, and I want it in writing that I'll have a say in this child's life." "Absolutely not," Daniel said immediately. "The child will be mine." "Then find someone else." Layla stood again. "Wait," Daniel said again, his mind racing. He needed this to work. "We can negotiate." And so began the strangest contract negotiation of Daniel's life. In a cheap diner, with coffee growing cold between them, a millionaire and a homeless woman hammered out the terms of creating a new life. Neither of them knew it then, but this was just the beginning. Their carefully planned arrangement would soon spiral into something neither of them expected, challenging everything Daniel thought he knew about love, family, and what really matters in life. As they shook hands to seal the deal, the evening sun cast long shadows through the diner's grimy windows. Daniel had gotten what he wanted, a solution to his heir problem. But he'd also gotten something he hadn't bargained for, a woman who wouldn't let him hide behind his money and privilege. Layla gathered her few belongings, ready to step into her new life. "Just remember," she said as they left the diner, "I may be homeless, but I'm not powerless. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can control me." Daniel watched her walk to his car, her head held high despite her ragged clothes. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain about what the future would bring, but one thing was clear: his life was about to change in ways he never imagined. The apartment Daniel arranged for Layla was in a decent neighborhood, not too fancy to draw attention, but safe and clean. He watched as she took in the furnished two-bedroom space, noting how she touched everything carefully, like she couldn't believe it was real. "The lease is in my name," Daniel said, placing the keys on the kitchen counter. "I've stocked the kitchen and set up utilities. You'll get a weekly allowance for expenses." Layla turned to face him. "When do we start the medical procedures?" "Tomorrow. I've arranged everything with Dr. Peterson. She's discreet and experienced with surrogacy." Daniel checked his Rolex. "The car will pick you up at 9 a.m. "Your car, you mean? With your driver?" Layla's voice had an edge to it. "Are you going to micromanage everything?" "Of course I am," Daniel snapped. "This is my child we're talking about. I need to make sure everything is perfect." The next few weeks fell into a routine. Doctor's appointments, vitamin regimens, scheduled meals. Daniel had his assistant create a detailed calendar for Layla to follow. Every morning, his driver James would report if she kept to the schedule. But Layla wasn't the compliant surrogate Daniel had hoped for. She missed appointments to go job hunting. She changed the meal plans. She turned down his offers for a personal chef and insisted on cooking for herself. "This isn't what we agreed to," Daniel confronted her one evening, holding up the schedule she'd ignored. "You need to follow the program." Layla was making dinner in the kitchen, the smell of spices filling the air. "No, what we agreed to was that I would carry your child while maintaining my dignity. I'm not your prisoner, Daniel. You're carrying my heir, and that means you own me." Layla slammed down the wooden spoon she was holding. "I'm taking my vitamins. I'm eating healthy. I'm getting enough rest, but I won't let you turn me into some kind of human incubator." Daniel ran his hands through his hair in frustration. This woman was impossible, nothing like the grateful, compliant surrogate he'd imagined. "Why do you have to fight me on everything?" "Because someone needs to remind you that I'm a person, not a possession." Layla stirred her pot of soup. "Would you like to stay for dinner? It's my grandmother's recipe." The invitation caught him off guard. "I have a business dinner." "Of course you do," she shrugged. "Heaven forbid you actually sit down and get to know the woman carrying your child." The words haunted Daniel through his fancy business dinner. While his colleagues talked about stock options and profit margins, he found himself wondering about that soup, about the grandmother who taught Layla to cook it. The next evening, he cancelled his dinner plans and showed up at Layla's door. She opened it wearing an apron, surprise clear on her face. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," Daniel said, feeling strangely nervous. "I thought maybe I could try that soup." A slow smile spread across Layla's face. "Come in, but you'll have to help chop vegetables." Daniel stared at her. "I don't cook." "Tonight you do." She handed him an apron. "Consider it part of your education in dealing with regular people." That night changed something between them. As Layla taught him to chop onions badly and showed him how to stir the pot too vigorously, Daniel found himself relaxing. They talked, really talked, for the first time. He learned about her life before homelessness, her job at the gallery, her dreams of being an artist. She told him about the illness that drained her savings and cost her everything. He found himself sharing things too, about the pressure of being an Everett, about his failed attempts to have children naturally. "Why didn't you just adopt?" Layla asked, passing him a bowl of soup. "Family legacy," Daniel said automatically, then frowned. "It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud." "A lot of things sound ridiculous when we actually say them out loud," Layla smiled. "Try the soup." It was the best thing Daniel had eaten in years, nothing like the fancy restaurants he usually frequented. This was real food, made with care and history. But more than the food, something else had shifted that evening. As they cleaned up together, another first for Daniel, he realized he was seeing Layla differently, not as a solution to his problem, but as a person, a fascinating, frustrating, incredibly strong person. The next morning, Daniel called his assistant. "Change my evening schedule," he said. "I'll be having dinner at Ms. Jackson's apartment, and ask her if she needs anything from the grocery store." His assistant was silent for a moment. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" Daniel looked at his reflection in his office window. No, he wasn't feeling all right. He was feeling something entirely new, and it terrified him. The positive pregnancy test changed everything. Daniel stared at it in his office, where Layla had brought it to show him, 2 blue lines that would change both their lives forever. The doctor confirmed it this morning, Layla said, one hand unconsciously touching her stomach. You're going to be a father. Daniel sat heavily in his leather chair. He'd wanted this, planned for it, but now that it was real, are you feeling okay? Do you need anything? I'm fine, Layla smiled. Morning sickness hasn't kicked in yet. Before Daniel could respond, his office door burst open. Caroline, his sister, stormed in wearing designer clothes and a furious expression. Daniel, we need to talk about the Wilson contract. She stopped short, seeing Layla. Who is this? Daniel stood up. Caroline, this is Layla Jackson. She's helping me with a personal matter. Caroline's eyes narrowed, taking in Layla's simple dress and natural hair. Personal matter? Since when do you conduct personal matters during business hours? I was just leaving, Layla said, gathering her purse. But Caroline blocked her path. Wait a minute, I know you. You're that homeless woman Daniel's been seen with. What kind of scam are you running? That's enough. Daniel's voice was sharp. Layla is here at my invitation, and she's carrying my child. The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline's face went from red to white. You're joking, she whispered. No, I'm not. Daniel moved to stand between his sister and Layla. This was my decision. A private arrangement. Private arrangement? Caroline laughed hysterically. Do you have any idea what this will do to our family? To the company? A baby with... Choose your next words very carefully, Daniel warned. But Layla had heard enough. I'll let you handle your family drama, she said quietly, slipping past them both. Layla, wait, Daniel called, but she was already gone. Caroline grabbed his arm. Have you lost your mind? Mother will have a heart attack. The board will never accept this. The board doesn't get a vote on my personal life, Daniel snapped. Neither do you. But his sister's words had hit home. What was he doing? This was supposed to be a simple business arrangement. Instead, he was defending Layla to his family, having dinners with her, thinking about her constantly. That evening, he went to her apartment. He found her painting in the spare room she'd turned into a studio, classical music playing softly. I'm sorry about Caroline, he said. Layla didn't look up from her canvas. She said exactly what I expected, what everyone in your world will say. They don't matter. Now she did look at him, her eyes sad. Of course they matter, Daniel. They're your family, your whole life. He moved closer, looking at her painting. It showed a woman standing alone in a storm, but with light breaking through the clouds. Is that how you feel? Alone in the storm? Sometimes. Layla put down her brush. Daniel, we need to be honest, things are getting complicated. How so? These dinners, our talks, the way you defended me today. She took a deep breath. We're not just surrogate and father anymore, and that's dangerous. Daniel knew she was right. Somewhere between the cooking lessons and late-night conversations, between doctor's appointments and quiet evenings, something had changed. He found himself looking forward to seeing her, missing her when they were apart. Maybe complicated isn't bad, he said quietly. Layla shook her head. Look at how your sister reacted, and she's just the beginning. Your mother, your friends, your business associates, they'll never accept me. You don't know that. I do know that, and so do you. Layla touched her stomach gently. This baby is one thing. They might eventually accept a mixed-race heir, especially if you raise it in your world. But me? A homeless black woman you found on the street? That's a scandal they'll never forgive. Daniel wanted to argue, but memories of a lifetime of family dinners, board meetings, and charity galas flashed through his mind. The casual racism, the whispered judgments, the rigid social hierarchy. So what do we do, he asked. We stick to the original plan. I have this baby, you raise it, and I start a new life somewhere else. Layla's voice was firm, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Daniel moved closer, drawn to her like a magnet. And if that's not what I want anymore, it doesn't matter what we want, Layla whispered. Some stories don't get happy endings. But even as she said it, Daniel was closing the distance between them. His hand cupped her cheek, and she leaned into his touch despite her words. Maybe, he said softly, it's time I wrote my own story. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, full of questions neither of them could answer. When they pulled apart, Layla's eyes were wide with surprise and fear. This changes everything, she said. Daniel nodded, already knowing his life would never be the same. Good. The news spread through Daniel's social circle like wildfire. By the time Sunday dinner at the Everett mansion arrived, everyone knew about Layla. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, sat at the head of the massive dining table, her face a mask of cold fury. "I assume," she said, cutting her roast beef with precise movements, "that this is some sort of mental breakdown. The stress of running the company has finally gotten to you." "I'm perfectly sane, Mother." Daniel kept his voice calm. "Layla and I care about each other." Caroline snorted into her wine glass. "Care about each other? She's a gold digger. She trapped you with this baby." "The baby was my idea," Daniel reminded them. "I chose her as a surrogate. And now, conveniently, she's managed to seduce you." Eleanor put down her fork. "Daniel, darling, think about what you're doing. Think about the family name." "I'm thinking about happiness for once," Daniel said. "Real happiness, not just keeping up appearances." Eleanor's face softened slightly. "If you're lonely, we can find you someone suitable. What about Victoria Henderson? She's recently divorced, comes from an excellent family." "I don't want Victoria Henderson." Daniel stood up, his napkin falling to the floor. "I want Layla. And if you can't accept that, then maybe I don't need to be at these family dinners anymore." He left the mansion feeling both terrified and free. But his relief was short-lived. The next morning, his uncle Richard called an emergency board meeting. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice grave, "the board has concerns about your recent behavior." Daniel looked around the table at the familiar faces, men and women who'd known him since childhood. Now they all stared at him like he was a stranger. "My personal life is not the board's concern," he said firmly. "It is when it affects stock prices," Richard replied, sliding over a tablet showing recent news headlines. "Your relationship with this woman is causing instability. Investors are nervous." "Then they're racists," Daniel said bluntly. An uncomfortable murmur ran through the room. These people weren't used to calling things what they were. "Daniel," Richard leaned forward, "no one is judging her background. But surely you see how this looks. A wealthy CEO suddenly taking up with a homeless woman." "I love her," Daniel said simply. More murmurs, more uncomfortable looks. Richard sighed heavily. "Then you leave us no choice. The board is calling for a vote of no confidence." "You can't be serious." "If you want to keep your position," Richard continued, "end this relationship. Send the woman away, with generous compensation, of course. Raise the child yourself. We can spin a story about a charitable surrogacy program." Daniel stared at his uncle, seeing for the first time the ugly truth behind the polite smiles and country club manners. "You want me to abandon the woman I love and lie about my child's mother?" "We want you to be sensible." Back at his office, Daniel found Layla waiting. One look at his face told her everything. "They're trying to force you to choose," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, sinking into his chair. "The board, my family, they're all acting like I've lost my mind." "Maybe you have." Layla came to stand beside him. "Daniel, I told you this would happen. Your world and mine don't mix." "Then maybe I don't want my world anymore." He pulled her into his lap, one hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. "We could leave, start fresh somewhere else." "You'd give up everything? Your company, your family, your whole life?" "None of it means anything if I have to be someone I'm not." He kissed her softly. "I'm tired of living by their rules." Layla touched his face gently. You say that now, but what about in a year, 5 years, when you're missing all of this?" "I won't miss being trapped in a life I didn't choose." But even as he said it, his phone buzzed with messages. His mother begging him to come talk. Caroline threatening to go to the press. The board demanding an answer. "I need time to think," he said finally. Layla stood up. "Take all the time you need. But Daniel?" She paused at the door. "Remember that this baby and I are a package deal now. If you choose us, you choose both of us. Forever." After she left, Daniel sat in his darkening office, staring at family photos on the wall. His father's stern face looked back at him, reminding him of everything he'd been raised to be. But when he closed his eyes, all he could see was Layla, cooking in her kitchen, painting in her studio, laughing at his attempts to be normal. And suddenly, the choice didn't seem so hard after all. He picked up his phone and dialed his mother's number. "We need to talk," he said, "but this time you're going to listen." Daniel walked into his mother's mansion the next day with a new sense of purpose. Eleanor Everett sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. Caroline paced by the window. "I've made my decision," Daniel announced without preamble. "I'm choosing Layla, and if that means losing the company, my position, This family, then that's what it means. Don't be dramatic, Caroline snapped. No one's asking you to give up everything, aren't you? Daniel turned to his mother. That's exactly what you're doing, trying to force me to choose between the woman I love and my family inheritance. Eleanor set down her teacup with a sharp clink. Love, you barely know this woman. I know she's kind. I know she's strong. I know she makes me laugh and challenges me to be better. Daniel sat across from his mother. I know she sees me as Daniel, not just as an Everett. And what about your child? Caroline demanded. Have you thought about what kind of life they'll have? Yes, I have. They'll have two parents who love them, who teach them to be proud of both sides of their heritage. Daniel's voice grew stronger. They won't grow up ashamed or hiding parts of themselves to fit someone else's expectations. Eleanor's face softened slightly. Daniel, we only want what's best for you. No, Mother. You want what's easiest for you. What looks best to your friends at the country club? Just then the butler appeared. Mr. Richard Everett and Mr. James Montgomery are here to see you, madam. Daniel's uncle and the head of the board walked in, both looking grave. Daniel, Richard said, we've come to offer a compromise. I'm not interested in compromises. Hear us out, James Montgomery said smoothly. We're prepared to let you keep your position as CEO. The board will accept your child as your heir. All we ask is discretion about the mother's identity and background. Daniel laughed bitterly. You want me to hide Layla away? Pretend she doesn't exist? It's a reasonable solution, Caroline insisted. The child gets everything, and that woman gets a comfortable life somewhere else. That woman, Daniel said coldly, is the mother of my child and the woman I love, and her name is Layla. He stood up, looking at each person in the room. You all talk about family legacy, about what's proper and right, but all I see is fear. Fear of change, fear of what people might say, fear of anything different from your narrow view of the world. Now see here, Richard started, but Daniel cut him off. No, you see here, I'm done living by your rules. I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. What are you doing? Eleanor asked nervously. Calling a press conference. Daniel's eyes were steely. It's time everyone knew the truth. You wouldn't dare, Caroline gasped. Try me. Daniel turned to leave, then paused. You know what's funny? All my life you taught me that being an Everett meant being strong, being a leader. Well, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm leading the way to change. He drove straight to Layla's apartment, finding her in her studio. Her baby bump was more visible now, and she'd never looked more beautiful to him. I told them, he said simply. Layla put down her paintbrush. How did they take it? About as well as we expected. He wrapped his arms around her. I'm calling a press conference. I want to tell everyone about us, about the baby. No more hiding. Daniel, Layla's voice was worried. Are you sure? Once you do this, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything. He touched her stomach gently. This is my family now. You and our baby. Layla's eyes filled with tears. What about the company? Let them try to force me out. I'll start my own company if I have to. He smiled. Maybe I'll open an art gallery. My girlfriend's a pretty talented artist. For the first time since they'd met, Layla laughed without any shadow of worry in her eyes. Your girlfriend? Well, I was hoping. Daniel got down on one knee, pulling out a small box. Maybe you'd consider a promotion to wife, Layla gasped. The ring was simple but elegant. Nothing like the flashy rocks his social circle favored. He'd chosen it specially for her. Daniel, your family will never accept this. Then they'll miss out on knowing their grandchild, and on knowing the amazing woman who made their son truly happy for the first time in his life. He took her hand. What do you say? The hotel ballroom was packed with reporters. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning. As Daniel walked to the podium, Layla by his side. She wore a simple blue dress that showed her growing baby bump, her engagement ring catching the light. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel began, his voice steady. Thank you for coming. I've called this press conference to address the rumors about my personal life. In the back of the room, he could see his family. Eleanor sat rigid in her chair, while Caroline whispered furiously with Uncle Richard. Yes, I am expecting a child, Daniel continued, and yes, I am engaged to be married. I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Layla Jackson. The room erupted with questions. Mr. Everett, is it true she was homeless? How did you meet? What about the company's stock prices? Was this a planned pregnancy? Daniel raised his hand for silence. I'll tell you exactly how we met. I was looking for a surrogate mother for my child. I found Layla, and yes, She was homeless at the time. But what I didn't expect was to fall in love with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. A reporter stood up. Ms. Jackson, what do you say to people who claim you planned this to trap Mr. Everett? Before Daniel could intervene, Layla stepped to the microphone. I say they don't know me or Daniel. Love doesn't look at bank accounts or social status. It just happens, whether you plan it or not. Her quiet dignity silenced the room. Daniel squeezed her hand, proud of her strength. The board of Everett Industries has expressed concerns, another reporter called out. Will you step down as CEO? That's up to the board, Daniel replied. But I won't hide my relationship or my child to keep my position. Some things are more important than money or power. In the back he saw Uncle Richard storm out, followed by several board members. His mother sat alone now, her face unreadable. After the press conference, Daniel and Layla retreated to her apartment. The street outside was already filling with paparazzi. Well, Layla said, kicking off her shoes, that was intense. Daniel loosened his tie. You were amazing. Did you see their faces when you talked about love? I saw your mother's face. Layla touched his arm gently. She looked heartbroken. She'll either accept us or she won't. That's her choice to make. His phone buzzed. Caroline calling again. He ignored it. Then came the email notifications. Stock prices dropping, investors demanding meetings, social invitations being rescinded. Your whole world is falling apart, Layla said quietly. No. Daniel pulled her close. My whole world is right here. But the next morning brought new challenges. The tabloids were vicious. Everett Heir's homeless hookup. Gold digger strikes gold. Society scandal. CEO's shocking affair. Layla tried to stay strong, but Daniel could see how the headlines hurt her. He found her crying in her studio, surrounded by half-finished paintings. We could still leave, she said. Go somewhere no one knows us. No, Daniel's voice was firm. We're not running away. This is our home, and they'll just have to deal with it. Then came an unexpected ally. James Montgomery's wife, Susan, arrived at their door. I had to come, she said, brushing past their surprise. What you did at that press conference, it was brave and right. She turned to Layla. My grandmother was black. My father passed for white his whole life, married my mother to maintain the deception. He died, never acknowledging his own mother in public. She took Layla's hands. What you and Daniel are doing matters. It matters so much. That evening, more supporters emerged. Young board members emailed their backing. College friends called to offer congratulations. Even some society mothers reached out, quietly admitting they admired Daniel's courage. But the biggest surprise came from Eleanor Everett. She arrived unannounced, looking somehow smaller without her usual armor of social superiority. I've been thinking, she said stiffly, about what Daniel said, about fear. She looked at Layla. I'm not ready to... this is all very sudden, but perhaps we could have tea sometime. Get to know each other. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Layla asked, do you regret any of it? Daniel touched her stomach, feeling their baby kick. Only that I wasted so much time caring what other people thought. You want to get married before the baby comes? Layla stared at the calendar on their kitchen wall. She was 7 months pregnant now, her belly prominent under her flowing dress. Why not? Daniel was making breakfast. He'd actually gotten good at it. We could have a small ceremony. Just us and a few friends. Your mother would never forgive you for not having a society wedding. My mother barely speaks to me as it is. Daniel flipped a pancake. Besides, this isn't about her. It's about us. Their quiet morning was interrupted by Caroline bursting through the door. Since the press conference, she'd appointed herself their unwanted wedding planner, trying to salvage what she called the social disaster. Good, you're both here, she said, dropping a thick binder on the table. I've been talking to the wedding planner at the plaza. We're not getting married at the plaza, Daniel interrupted. Of course you are. It's where all Everetts get married. Caroline flipped through her binder. I've already penciled in a date for next spring after the baby. We're getting married next month, Layla said quietly. In the botanical gardens. Caroline's face went pale. Next month? But that's impossible. The press will say you're rushing because of the baby. We are rushing because of the baby, Daniel said. We want to be married before our child arrives. But the gardens? It's so common. Caroline wrinkled her nose. What about the country club? The same country club that rejected my membership application last week. Layla's voice was sharp. No, thank you. Caroline had the grace to look embarrassed. The country club's rejection had made headlines, especially since Daniel had been a member since birth. Fine, Caroline sighed. the gardens, but at least let me handle the guest list. We need to make sure the right people attend. The right people? Daniel laughed. You mean the same people who've been spreading rumors about Layla, who cancelled our dinner invitations, who whisper behind our backs at charity events? They're your world, Daniel. Your business associates, your social circle. Not anymore. Daniel put down his spatula. Our guest list will be people who support us, people who care about our happiness, not our social status. Caroline looked like she might cry. Mother will be devastated. Mother hasn't even RSVP'd yet, Daniel reminded her. After Caroline left, Layla found Daniel in the nursery they were preparing. He was assembling a crib surrounded by pieces of expensive baby furniture. Your sister means well, Layla said softly. She means to turn our wedding into another society event. Daniel tightened a screw with more force than necessary. I'm done with all that. Are you? Layla sat in the rocking chair they'd bought together. Daniel, that world was your life for 45 years. You can't just pretend it doesn't exist. Watch me. I'm serious. Layla rubbed her belly thoughtfully. Our child will be an Everett. They'll inherit your company someday. They need to know both sides of their heritage, including the privileged world you came from. Daniel put down his screwdriver. That world is toxic. Parts of it are, but running away isn't the answer. Layla reached for his hand. Maybe we need to find a middle ground. Create our own path. Before Daniel could respond, Layla gasped. What's wrong? He was instantly at her side. Nothing, she smiled, placing his hand on her stomach. The baby's kicking. Feel it? The moment was interrupted by Daniel's phone ringing. It was James Montgomery. Daniel, James sounded tired. The board vote is tomorrow. I've done what I can, but it doesn't look good. I understand. Daniel kept his hand on Layla's belly, feeling their child move. Whatever happens, happens. After hanging up, he told Layla about the vote. They'll probably remove me as CEO. I'm so sorry. Layla's eyes filled with tears. This is all because of me. No. Daniel knelt before her. This is because of them. Their prejudice, their narrow minds. He smiled suddenly. Actually, I'm glad. Glad? About losing your company? Glad that our child will grow up seeing their parents stand up for what's right? Glad that we're breaking this cycle of prejudice and privilege? He kissed her softly. Besides, I meant what I said about opening an art gallery. Layla laughed through her tears. You're crazy. Crazy about you. That evening, as they sat on their balcony watching the sunset, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text. It was from his mother. What does she say? Layla asked, seeing his expression change. Daniel showed her the message. I'll be there, at the wedding, and I'm bringing your grandmother's pearls for Layla. The botanical gardens were beautiful in the early morning light. White chairs lined the rose garden path, and simple flower arches marked the way to the ceremony space. It wasn't the grand society wedding the Everetts were known for, but it was perfect for Daniel and Layla. In the bridal suite, Layla stood before a mirror, her 8-month pregnant belly prominent under the flowing white dress she'd chosen. Susan Montgomery was helping her with her hair when Eleanor Everett knocked on the door. May I come in? Eleanor's voice was unusually hesitant. Layla nodded and Susan quietly excused herself. Eleanor approached, holding a velvet box. These pearls, Eleanor said, opening the box, have been worn by Everett brides for 4 generations. She lifted the necklace. My mother-in-law gave them to me on my wedding day. I'd like you to wear them. Layla's eyes filled with tears. Are you sure? Yes. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she fastened the pearls around Layla's neck. They look beautiful on you. She paused. I know I haven't been welcoming, but seeing Daniel these past months, how happy he is. Maybe I was wrong about some things. Before Layla could respond, they heard shouting outside. Caroline burst in, her face pale. Uncle Richard is here with the board members. They're threatening to announce Daniel's removal as CEO right now during the wedding. They wouldn't dare. Eleanor's face hardened. This is my son's wedding day. They're saying it's their last chance to force him to reconsider, to choose the company over me, Layla finished quietly. Eleanor straightened her spine. Well, they'll have to get through me first. She marched toward the door, every inch the family matriarch. No one ruins an Everett wedding, not even other Everetts. In the groom's room, Daniel was adjusting his tie when James Montgomery entered. Richard's here, James said without preamble, with the voting members. Daniel sighed. Of course he is. One last attempt to control me. Daniel, James looked uncomfortable. The vote was unanimous. You're out as CEO. They're planning to announce it during the ceremony for maximum impact. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Let them. Let them. But your reputation, your position, means nothing compared to what I'm gaining today. Daniel checked his reflection one last time. Besides, I've been working on something they don't know about. What do you mean? I mean, I've spent the last 2 months talking to investors. Young, progressive ones who like the idea of a company that embraces change. Daniel turned to his friend. I'm starting my own company, James, and I'd like you to join me. Meanwhile, in the garden, guests were arriving. It was a smaller crowd than usual for an Everett wedding, but more diverse. Artists from Layla's old gallery mixed with younger business executives. Susan Montgomery sat with her grandmother, proudly introducing her to society friends. Uncle Richard and the board members stood in a group, looking out of place among the casual garden setting. But before they could make their move, Eleanor Everett approached them. "Richard," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "if you do anything to disrupt this wedding, I will personally ensure that every society event, every charity board, every country club in this city closes its doors to you." She smiled coldly. "Try me." The ceremony was about to begin when Layla suddenly clutched her stomach. "Are you okay?" Susan asked worriedly. "Just Braxton Hicks," Layla assured her. "The doctor said they might happen. I'm fine." But as she took her first step down the aisle, she felt something else, her water breaking. The garden erupted in chaos. Eleanor took charge, calling her private doctor. Caroline ran for Daniel. Guests whispered and pointed. Daniel rushed to Layla's side. "The baby's coming now?" Layla managed a weak smile. "Apparently our little one wants to be part of the wedding too." "Get her to the hospital," Eleanor ordered. "Susan, bring her bag from the bridal suite. Caroline, call ahead to the maternity ward." But Layla grabbed Daniel's hand. "Wait, marry me first." "What, but the baby?" "The contractions are still far apart, please." She looked at him desperately. "I want us to be married when our baby comes." Daniel looked at the doctor, who nodded. "We have time for a quick ceremony." What followed was perhaps the fastest wedding in Everett history. The minister rushed through the vows, while Layla breathed through contractions. Guests stood rather than sat, ready to move at a moment's notice. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said quickly. "You may kiss." Layla groaned with another contraction. "Kiss later," Eleanor commanded. "Hospital now." As Daniel helped Layla to the car, he heard Uncle Richard call out, "The board vote." "My wife is having our baby," Daniel shouted back. "Fire me tomorrow." The private wing of St. Luke's Hospital was chaos. Eleanor Everett had taken over the waiting room, directing traffic like a general commanding troops. Caroline paced nervously while talking to the press on her phone. Uncle Richard and the board members hovered uncertainly in the background, their plans for a corporate takeover forgotten in the excitement of the baby's arrival. In the delivery room, Layla still wore her wedding dress, now draped with a hospital gown. The family pearls gleamed at her throat. "You're still the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," Daniel said, holding her hand through another contraction. "Even sweating and screaming?" Layla managed a weak smile. Especially then. Hours passed. The doctor had assured them everything was progressing normally, but Daniel had never felt so helpless. All he could do was support Layla as she did the hard work of bringing their child into the world. Outside, an unlikely peace had settled over the family. Eleanor found herself sharing coffee with Susan Montgomery's grandmother, listening to stories about raising mixed-race children in a prejudiced world. Caroline sat quietly, watching her mother's face soften with understanding. Even Uncle Richard seemed affected by the moment. "Perhaps," he said to James Montgomery, "we've been too hasty about some things." Finally, in the early hours of the morning, a baby's cry pierced the hospital quiet. Minutes later, Daniel emerged from the delivery room, tears streaming down his face. "It's a girl," he announced. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect in every way. Eleanor was the first to reach him. "And Layla, she's amazing. Tired but happy." Daniel hugged his mother impulsively. "Would you like to meet your granddaughter?" The room that had hosted so much tension now filled with joy. Eleanor entered first, approaching the bed where Layla cradled their daughter. "Oh," Eleanor breathed, seeing the baby's face. "She's beautiful." The baby had Layla's warm brown skin tone and Daniel's blue eyes, a perfect blend of both her parents. "Would you like to hold her?" Layla asked softly. Eleanor carefully took the baby, tears falling as she counted tiny fingers and toes. "What's her name?" Daniel and Layla exchanged a look. "We'd like to call her Hope," Layla said. "Hope Eleanor Everett." Eleanor's head snapped up. Eleanor? After her grandmother, Daniel said. If that's okay? For the first time in months, Eleanor Everett was speechless. She looked down at her granddaughter, then back at Layla. Thank you, she whispered. The moment was interrupted by Uncle Richard clearing his throat. Daniel, about the board vote. Not now, Richard, Eleanor said sharply. No, let him speak, Daniel said, never taking his eyes off his wife and daughter. Richard shifted uncomfortably. The thing is, at seeing all this, maybe we were wrong. The world is changing. Maybe it's time Everett Industries changed too. Are you offering me my job back? Daniel asked. Yes, with some conditions of course, but no. Daniel's voice was firm but kind. No? Several people spoke at once. I meant what I said about starting my own company, one that reflects our values, that embraces diversity. He smiled at Layla. One that our daughter can be proud to inherit someday. Caroline stepped forward. Then let me invest. Everyone stared at her. What? She shrugged. My trust fund is mine to use, and maybe it's time for a change. James Montgomery raised his hand. Count me in too. One by one, others joined in. Even Uncle Richard finally nodded. Perhaps we could discuss a partnership between the companies. Baby Hope began to fuss, and Eleanor gently handed her back to Layla. Watching her daughter-in-law soothe the baby, she made a decision. The Everett Foundation, she announced. It's time it had a new direction. Layla, would you consider heading up a new initiative, supporting arts programs in underprivileged communities? Layla's eyes widened. Are you serious? Entirely. Eleanor straightened her jacket. It's time we used our privilege for something meaningful. Looking around the room, Daniel saw everything he'd ever wanted, but hadn't known he needed. His wife, his daughter, his family coming together in ways he never expected. Welcome to the world, Hope, he whispered, kissing his daughter's forehead. You've already worked your first miracle. The gallery opening was the event of the season. Hope's Place read the elegant sign above the entrance, its windows displaying a mix of established and emerging artists. Inside, the walls showcased diverse talents from every community in the city. Layla stood in the center of it all, greeting guests with baby Hope on her hip. At 1-year-old, Hope was a perfect mix of her parents, with curly brown hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could charm anyone. The children's art program is already full for next semester, Layla told a reporter, and the Scholarship Foundation has sponsored 10 new artists this year. The gallery was Daniel's wedding gift to her, but Layla had turned it into something bigger, a community center for arts education and a launching pad for underprivileged artists. The Everett Foundation, under her leadership, had expanded its reach into arts programs across the city. Eleanor Everett arrived, immediately reaching for her granddaughter. There's my precious girl. She had traded her designer suits for more casual clothes these days, at least when she was on grandmother duty. Mother, you just saw her this morning, Daniel laughed, joining them. His new company, Everett Innovation, had just been named one of the most progressive employers in the city. A grandmother can never see too much of her grandbaby. Eleanor bounced Hope gently, especially one who finger paints as beautifully as this one. The gallery's back wall displayed a collection of children's art, including Hope's colorful attempts. Eleanor had every one of her granddaughter's artistic efforts framed in her office. Caroline arrived with her surprise +1, Marcus Chen, a community organizer she'd met through Layla's outreach programs. The family pretended not to notice how close they stood together. The board meeting went well, she told Daniel. The partnership between his new company and Everett Industries had proved profitable for both sides. Even Uncle Richard admitted you were right about diversifying our investments. Uncle Richard himself appeared, looking more relaxed than anyone could remember. Layla, that piece in the East Wing, the one with the homeless woman and the sunrise, it's remarkable. Thank you, Layla said. The artist was living in her car when we found her. Now she's teaching art at the community center. The gallery filled with an interesting mix of people, society matrons chatting with street artists, business executives admiring work by children from the inner city, old money mingling with new talent. It was everything Daniel and Layla had hoped for. Susan Montgomery's grandmother held court in one corner, telling stories about the old days to a group of young artists. Things change, she said wisely, if you're brave enough to help them change. As the evening wound down, Daniel found Layla in her office, once her studio where she still painted when time allowed. Hope was asleep in her playpen, clutching the stuffed bunny Eleanor had bought her. Happy? He asked, wrapping his arms around his wife. More than I ever dreamed possible. Layla leaned back against him. You know, when you first made that surrogacy offer, I thought you were crazy. I was. Daniel kissed her neck. Crazy to think I could keep my heart from falling in love with you. Through the office window, they could see the city lights twinkling. Somewhere out there, another homeless person might be dreaming of a better life. Another artist might be waiting to be discovered. Another love story might be ready to break down barriers. Hope's going to have a sister, Layla said quietly. Daniel froze. Are you 8 weeks? Layla turned to face him. I confirmed it yesterday. Daniel's whoop of joy brought Eleanor rushing in. What's happening? You're getting another grandchild, Daniel announced. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears of joy. The news spread quickly through the gallery. Caroline hugged Marcus in her excitement. Uncle Richard ordered champagne for everyone. James Montgomery started taking bets on whether it would be a boy or girl. Later that night, after the guests had gone, and Hope was tucked into her crib at home, Daniel and Layla stood on their balcony. Did you ever imagine this? Layla asked. That night in the diner, when we made our deal? Never. Daniel pulled her close. I thought I was just solving a problem. Instead, I found everything I never knew I was looking for. Inside, Hope made a small sound in her sleep. Soon, another baby would join their family. The nursery would need redecorating, but this time Eleanor had already volunteered to help. We should start a college fund for the new baby, Daniel mused. Layla laughed. Always the businessman. Speaking of business, Daniel grinned. The community center's arts program needs a new director. Interested? Are you offering me a job, Mr. Everett? I'm offering you whatever you want, Mrs. Everett. The world's changing, and we're changing it together. Layla touched her stomach, where their second miracle was growing. Together, she agreed, that's all I ever wanted. Above them, the stars twinkled over the city. In their home, their daughter slept peacefully, and in their hearts, the love that had broken down barriers and changed lives continued to grow stronger with each passing day. The end.